Good evening.
We don't need that. Good evening. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Alain Epp Weaver from the Mennonite Central Committee, who will be speaking tonight on the church's witness in an age of perpetual war. As you know, the Mennonite Church is considered one of the peace churches, and so their approach to violence and war is rooted in the Gospels. And so I think tonight's talk will be challenging. Alan is their Director of Strategic Planning, right? So, yes, Strategic Planning. And as I talked to him a little bit before, the Mennonite Central Committee is busy at work doing relief in the Philippines. As we all know, the typhoon that went through there literally destroyed some of the towns, and the Mennonite Central Committee, along with other denominations, are actively working. I asked him if that included the tornado damage in the Midwest, and he said that's the Mennonite Disaster Service that does that. So I think tonight, as Alan leads us in prayer, if we could keep in mind the work of the Mennonite Central Committee, the Mennonite Disaster Committee, and the people of the Philippines, and the people in our own country who are suffering.
So I'm happy to be here at the podium, but I also don't want to be too loud or have reverberation, so I can maybe move it over here. Can you hear me if I talk like this?
Yes.
Okay, if I start being too loud, let me know that too. My wife often tells me that I do get too loud. Before we enter into a time of prayer, I would just note that yes, Mennonite Central Committee is responding in the Philippines. We're responding there in partnership with Church World Service. And I know that many denominations, many different Christian denominations take part in the work of Church World Service. And so it's very much an ecumenical effort by Mennonite Central Committee, by many other churches, working in partnership with the churches in the Philippines. So let's pray together, lifting up the work of the church in the Philippines and how churches in the United States are helping to respond to those needs. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, our minds and our hearts are heavy as we think about your people in the Philippines who've lost the security of homes, community infrastructures. And we are thinking especially of the witness of your church in the Philippines as it seeks to be salt and light in that country and reach out throughout the country to show your love in practical ways by rebuilding communities and rebuilding homes. And Lord, we're mindful also that the Philippines, like many other countries in the world, are ravaged by different types of conflict. And we know that part of rebuilding will mean being sensitive to those conflicts and seeking to resolve them nonviolently. And we know that your church plays an integral role in that type of rebuilding. Be with us here this evening as we discern together how best to love our neighbors, including in an age that seems like it's an age of perpetual war and rumors of war. Be with our minds and our mouths as we discern together. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. Amen. Well, it's wonderful to be here with you this evening. It's a great turnout for a Monday evening. And I have to say that it's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. The microphone's not bothering people?
No.
Okay, good. But it's also a little intimidating for me, because as I was preparing for this talk, I looked over the program that shows your schedule for the year, And my goodness, you have an amazing lineup of presenters for this Monday Adult Forum, and it really is tackling some challenging and rich topics. So this is clearly a group that isn't intimidated by and likes to grapple with challenging topics. So I can't promise you that I'm going to reach the heights of insight or the depths of profundity that your previous speakers have reached. But I am confident that this is an engaged group of conversation partners, and that we can think together about what the church's witness should be in an age of perpetual war. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Any discussion about how Christians should think about war, whether wars of the past or what I've referred to in the title of this talk as perpetual war, begins with Jesus' command to his disciples to love your neighbor as yourself. I'll begin the first part of this talk by offering an overview of ground that you're maybe already familiar with, so beg my indulgence on this score, namely talking about the differences among Christians about what the command of neighbor love means when it comes to determine whether or not it's legitimate for a Christian to take human life in any circumstance, let alone in war. Does the command of neighbor love rule out Christian participation in war completely? Or can certain types of wars, under certain types of constraints, be understood as legitimate forms of neighbor love? How Christians have answered these questions have led to very real divisions among Christians, divisions that persist and are not inconsequential. And I certainly don't mean to diminish the importance of the theological issues at stake that divide pacifist Christians, like Mennonites, and Christians who believe that participation in war is sometimes legitimate. And the first part of this talk will involve an overview of what theological claims are involved in this discussion and debate. In the second part of the talk, however, I'll suggest that while pacifist and just war Christians remain divided on what the command of neighbor love, on how the command of neighbor love should shape our response to war, adherents of pacifist and just war positions have more reason than ever, I will argue, to find common ground in the face of an American military system that has progressively expanded its global reach and involvement from the 1970s onwards, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, and in the face of a perpetual war waged as a global war on terror. All Christians, I will suggest, should have good theological reasons for concern about an imperial expansion of the United States' military reach around the world, about new technologies that promise the acceleration of that reach, and about how the all-volunteer military has placed the experience of war outside the day-to-day realm of what most Americans experience, with the pernicious result that politicians of all parties face little political pressure to constrain military adventures, and in fact have political incentives to avoid criticizing military interventions undertaken by the government on the grounds that such criticism might open them up to attacks from opponents for not supporting the troops or being unpatriotic. Pacifist and just war Christians can and should find common ground, I will argue, in offering a skeptical take on the imperial war machine that has developed over the past several decades within the United States, and on the destructive impact that that system has had on our politics. Even if we as Christians are to affirm that some wars can be justifiable expressions of neighbor love. We have good reasons to suspect, I will suggest, that most, if not all, wars waged by the United States over the past 3 decades cannot be defended as legitimate expressions of neighbor love. So to the first part of the talk, about whether or not participation in war can ever be defended as a response to Jesus' call to love our neighbors. Now, it should be noted up front, I would suggest, that honesty about Christian history should compel us to confess that too often Christians have waged war without concern with whether or not the wars in question were legitimate forms of neighbor love, but rather out of revenge or with the aim of conquest, with such wars baptized with a religious purpose. In other words, far too many wars in Christian history have been versions of holy wars rather than just wars, waged not out of the concern to protect innocent neighbors, but rather out of self-righteous quests for revenge, in which Christians have claimed for themselves the right to carry out vengeance, which should belong to God alone, or as part of violent conquests of people and territory that have been justified on religious grounds or their secularized counterparts, like as a city on a hill, as an exceptional nation, the United States has a manifest destiny to conquer all of the Americas, or we, the French, have a civilizing mission to bring culture to the benighted nations of Africa by violent force and conquest if necessary, and those types of arguments. Because such wars, these types of holy wars, see Christians conflating their own self-interested purposes with God's, the very real danger exists that there will be no limitations to or constraints on the violence carried out in those wars. And in fact, we have to confess, as we look at Christian history, that the genocides carried out by Christians in God's name throughout the church's history bear witness to the stark reality that far too many wars waged by allegedly Christian nations have been exercises in either revenge or the self-interested conquest of territory and resources, wars not shaped soberly by neighbor love, but wars driven instead by hatred of perceived enemies, by arrogant pride of thinking of one's people as superior or more civilized than other peoples, and by the idolatrous assumption that we have a divine right to subjugate other peoples and steal their resources. Put another way, holy wars, both past and present, waged by Christians, lose sight of the fact that Jesus reveals to us a radicalized understanding of the neighbor, one in which one's perceived enemies, like the Samaritan in the parable of the Good Samaritan, come to be understood as one's neighbors, neighbors whom we are called to love. Holy wars instead place restrictions on who we understand to be our neighbors, restrictions that I would argue cannot be defended in the light of the gospel. The just war tradition within Christian thought, in contrast, which can be traced back at least to St. Augustine, represents an attempt to place constraints on war and to define criteria by which to assess whether or not specific wars can be justified as expressions of neighbor love. War, in the context of the just war tradition, can be a legitimate form of neighbor love to the extent that those wars are undertaken to protect and defend innocent persons from harm and with the purpose of securing a just peace. Yes, war will mean the killing of the enemy, who is also my neighbor, but that is not, just war proponents argue, incompatible with the Christian command to love the enemy. the enemy who is also the neighbor, because the primary intent of war is to protect and defend the innocent neighbor and to secure a just peace. The primary intent of the war is not to kill the enemy who is also my neighbor. Theologians of the just war tradition have distinguished two broad types of criteria for use in determining the legitimacy of particular wars from a Christian perspective. One set of these criteria relate to whether or not there is a justifiable reason for engaging in the war in the first place. This is often referred to using the Latin term jus ad bellum. The other set of criteria is referred to using the Latin phrase jus in bello, and that refers to how war is waged. Once you've entered the war, how are you carrying it out? That is, what particular tactics or actions are permissible in a legitimate war. The criteria of jus ad bellum, or the criteria used to determine whether or not to enter into a war, include the following. Is the war being waged by legitimate authority? Is it being carried out with a right intention? That is it being carried out with the purpose of protecting one's neighbors or for securing a just peace? A just peace that would benefit one's neighbors. Does the war have a reasonable chance of success? Is there a reasonable hope that the desired outcome of a just peace might be secured? For the just war tradition, human life should not be wasted on fool's errands or missions that will likely fail. Is the war a proportional response to the injustice that the war is intended to redress? And is the war a last resort for addressing that injustice? Have all diplomatic and other nonviolent means been used to respond to that injustice? Or have parties rushed to war out of bloodlust, or the desire for revenge, or the desire for conquest of territory and resources? A just war must also be conducted in a just manner. These are, again, the jus in bello criteria. And these criteria that are used to determine whether or not a war is being carried out in the right manner include questions like, are safeguards put in place to prevent or to minimize harm to civilians, to non-combatants? Is fighting brought to a conclusion as quickly as possible, rather than prolonging the fighting to secure outcomes other than the just outcomes for which the war was initially fought? Are people and property not connected to the war effort protected from hardship? Is the dignity of enemy combatants protected? For example, are prisoners of war treated humanely, or are they tortured? Are corpses, insofar as is possible, treated with dignity? And so on. Taken seriously, these two sets of criteria, the jus ad bellum criteria about whether or not to enter into a war, and the jus in bello criteria about how wars are carried out, should significantly restrict Christian participation in war and should limit the types of actions carried out by Christians in war. Christian pacifists express skepticism about how much functional purchase these criteria have in reality. That is, they are doubtful about how effective these types of criteria are in actually helping Christians to say no to particular wars or to curbing illegitimate behavior in the course of war. But that skepticism shouldn't detract from the fact that the just war tradition is at its core an attempt to determine under what conditions the command of neighbor love, with the command of the enemy again simply being a special case of the command of neighbor love, can be followed. Christian pacifists, for their part, insist that the command of neighbor love and the command to love one's enemies means that Christians should never deliberately take a human life. And that means that Christian pacifists must reject participation in war. And a few comments about terminology are in order here. Specifically, it's important to distinguish between Christian pacifism on the one hand and Christian non-resistance. Historically, groups like the Mennonites, the Amish, the Church of the Brethren did not talk about pacifism, but rather talked about what they call non-resistance, building on Jesus' command to his disciples to resist not evil. The church on this account, the non-resistant account, is called to be separate from the world, or more accurately, not to be conformed to the ways of the world, as Paul admonishes the church in Rome. One form of nonconformity to the world, from this Amish traditional Mennonite perspective, is a refusal, in the language of the 16th century, a refusal to bear the sword, that is, to participate in war or to carry out government functions such as execution. Non-resistance from this perspective flows not only from a response to Jesus' call to love one's enemies and to resist not evil, but also from an understanding of history that we could maybe call, to use fancy theological language, an eschatological understanding of history, an understanding of history viewed from the end of time in terms of how God is ultimately working to reconcile all of creation to God. And so this eschatological understanding of history stresses that it is God who is ultimately in control of history, and that therefore judgment in the form of taking human life belongs to God alone, and that Christians therefore should not undertake to ever take human life because it's usurping a function that belongs to God alone. Not surprisingly, Christians with non-resistant convictions tend to separate themselves from their surrounding societies in different ways, including non-participation in the military. But non-resistant Christians also tend to be fairly quietist. They don't go out marching in the streets organizing anti-war protests about wars carried out by the state, because the state, from this perspective, and again the Amish are representative here, the state is understood as a non-Christian sphere that's been ordained by God to preserve fallen creation. And God can and does work through the state, the Amish and traditional Mennonites would believe, to punish wrongdoers. The church, in contrast, lives to testify to God's redeeming activity through its own existence. Through a non-resistant life, groups like the Amish offer a witness to a different form of embodied social life than does the state. Yet, the Amish do not look to criticize particular wars carried out by that state. For their critics, groups like the Amish are fundamentally sectarian, maybe even irresponsible, maybe even, stated very harshly, parasitic, because the argument goes, they depend on the state for the security they enjoy while refusing to participate in the defense of that state. For the Amish and similar groups, they ultimately show their love for neighbor and the world beyond the church by refusing to kill and by being faithful to Jesus' commands, and that represents their form of responsibility. Pacifist Christians share with non-resistant Christians the conviction that the command of neighbor love, and I'll say once again, the command of neighbor love includes the command of enemy love, forbids Christians from taking human life, and this also means not joining the military. Pacifist Christians depart from the traditional non-resistance in adopting a more activist political stance. Less concerned about maintaining physical markers of nonconformity to the world. So I'm a Mennonite, but as you can see, I'm not in traditional Old Order Mennonite garb. I could be a Lutheran Episcopalian, for heaven's sakes, in terms of how I dress. And I enjoy worshiping at Lutheran and Episcopalian churches on occasion as well. But so pacifist Christians carry out actions that non-resistant Christians would view as worldly and as violating the command to be non-resistance, like voting, participating in local politics, and even potentially national politics. So for example, my great-great-grandfather who lived in South Dakota was a member of the South Dakota State Senate, which is something that traditional Mennonites out of this part of the country would never have countenanced. Also taking part in nonviolent protests. And so in the 1950s and 1960s, there was an active debate on some Mennonite college campuses about whether or not good Mennonites could, say, participate in civil rights marches, not because they held racist convictions that there shouldn't be civil rights or that people of different races should be treated unequally, but because protest marches were viewed as coercive, as potentially resisting evil in a coercive manner, and therefore were not non-resistant. And so, and Don Crable at Elizabethtown College has written a wonderful book called From Quietism to Activism, which charts this shift within Mennonites who dress like me, basically, from a non-resistant politics, which meant more of a separation from the world, to an embrace of active nonviolence along the lines of, say, a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King Jr. So while in places like Lancaster County, there are still many Mennonites and Amish of different groupings that adhere to the traditional position of non-resistance, many Mennonites during the course of the 20th century made this shift from quietism to activism, in Don Crable's language. And the political sphere as being outside the order of redemption, pacifist Christians exhibit greater optimism that nonviolent alternatives to war can be found, that alternative nonviolent responses to injustice can work, and that nonviolent action can effectively counter violence. Mennonite groups who have shifted from non-resistance to pacifism over the course of the past 100 years or so have joined pacifists from Protestant and Catholic groupings like the Fellowship of Reconciliation or the Catholic worker movement in an active embrace of nonviolence as a proactive, practical alternative to war. Now, my description above of just war, non-resistance, and pacifism as different forms of neighbor love has named some of the critiques that these different theological positions have of one another. And I'll briefly name here a few more standard critiques that these groups have of one another. For just war supporters, Christian pacifists have what they view as a naive optimism about the human will that leads them to invest too much hope in the power of nonviolence. Often drawing on Augustine's theological understanding of the human, or again to use fancy theological anthropology, just war critics of pacifism stress the corruption of the human will and the accompanying need to be prepared to use violence to preserve some semblance of peace and justice in a fallen world. A just war defender, like the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr from the middle of the 20th century, and Reinhold Niebuhr, you might remember, has been cited by President Obama as his favorite political philosopher. So Niebuhr granted that groups like the Amish, with their embrace of non-resistance, embody in a rigorous, serious fashion the command to love one's neighbors, including one's enemies. But he went on to argue that such an ethic, a non-resistant ethic, could only ever be realistic within small communities withdrawn or separated from the wider society, which of course, describes Amish, Old Order Mennonite life. In the broader political world, Niebuhr argued, the demands of earthly justice make an absolute refusal of violent force in all circumstances not only unrealistic, but dangerously naive. The deep problem with Christian pacifism on this type of account is that it mistakenly tries to take an ethic that is at best only workable in interpersonal relationships and tries to move it into the much more complex world of political relationships and relationships between nations. Christian pacifists have responded to this critique in several ways. First, while it must be granted that some Christian pacifists have an unjustified confidence in the power of nonviolent action to effectively counter all forms of violent conflict and injustice, many Christian pacifists stress that the ultimate concern of Christians should be faithfulness rather than effectiveness. Christian pacifists might put forward ideas for how nonviolent action and strategies might be alternatives to war in addressing situations of injustice, oppression, and conflict, but that is not the same as a guarantee that those ideas will necessarily work. Sober Christian pacifists, I guess as opposed to the drunk ones, recognize that sometimes nonviolence will fail. Second, and related, Christian pacifists frame their rejection of violent force within this eschatological horizon, this view of God being ultimately in control of history. And that is, again, with the understanding that it's God, not human beings, who ultimately is in control of history, and that it's therefore not the Christian's responsibility to make sure that history comes out right through the use of violent means. Persons in the United States, including myself, are often tempted to view the United States as a key to world history. Part of the baggage, I'll suggest a little later in the talk, of thinking of the United States as an exceptional nation. Christian pacifists, in contrast, underscore that a theological understanding of history should be focused on God rather than on what pacifists tend to view as idolatrous claims that a particular nation is the chosen vehicle for realizing God's purposes in history. Third, Christian pacifists argue that just war proponents are too confident about what people can reasonably be expected to know. Specifically, just war defenders argue that the limited use of violent force and limited wars can be waged with a reasonable confidence that these wars and violent actions will produce a peaceful state of affairs and will produce positive outcomes, the addressing of injustice and oppression, or the achievement of a more peaceful state of affairs. Here, some Christian pacifists have turned to St. Augustine to use Augustine's writings against just war proponents, which is somewhat ironic since Augustine, again, is often viewed as the father of just war thinking. But here they argue that an Augustinian recognition of how our knowledge, or more precisely what we think we know, is distorted by our disordered loves, that is, by greed, by hatred, by other vices, and that these distorted loves will inevitably shape our perceptions and our calculations regarding the reasonable success of achieving positive outcomes through war. And when one looks at all of the unintended and unforeseen consequences, at least not foreseen by our political and military leaders of the past couple of decades, of the U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, one would have to admit, I think, that this argument has some purchase. Just war proponents may criticize Christian pacifists for a naive optimism about the human will, but Christian pacifists can turn that argument around and argue that just war proponents might have a naive optimism that wars and lethal violence will produce the beneficial outcomes that they want to achieve. All right, that's been my whirlwind tour of the theological issues at stake among just war Christians, pacifist Christians, and non-resistant Christians, about these intra-Christian debates about what neighbor love and enemy love demand of Christians in relationship to war. The remainder of this presentation will now shift to thinking about how to connect those debates to the situation in which the United States now finds itself in the early days of the 21st century, namely in a state of what I'm calling perpetual war. Might this relatively new reality of perpetual war help just war Christians and pacifist Christians find more common ground, even as they continue to have real theological differences that divide them? Within the realm of foreign policy, the decades from the early 1980s onwards has seen the dominance of what might be called an internationalist approach to U.S. foreign policy under both Republican and Democratic leadership. While there was arguably a brief period in the final years of the Vietnam War and ensuing years in which there was some limited questioning of the desirable extent of and projection of U.S. military strength around the globe, from the Reagan era onward, the number of U.S. military bases has expanded dramatically, again under both Democratic and Republican administrations. Conservative figures place the number of U.S. military bases around the world at well over 700 in over 130 countries. Now, granted, some of those are fairly small military bases. This expansion has gone largely unquestioned within the Washington Beltway as an inevitable positive given. Now, to be sure, there's been some limited debates within Washington circles over the past 3 decades about foreign policy and military intervention, with the so-called neoconservatives on the one hand abandoning the isolationism of traditional conservatism to push for wars either for economic gain or for more high-minded aims such as bringing democracy to the Middle East. And on the other hand, with liberal interventionists like the current United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, championing armed humanitarian intervention in places like Libya and Syria. These debates are real and aren't inconsequential. But tellingly, both neoconservatives and humanitarian interventionists both stand as heirs to a type of global interventionism in U.S. foreign policy that Woodrow Wilson pioneered, and they also both leave unquestioned the ever-expanding scope of the U.S. military, whether that scope is understood in terms of territory or in terms of technology. And they both embrace an understanding of the United States and its military as having pivotal, one might even say elect, roles to play within world affairs. Critics of this shared Republican and Democratic military interventionism and critics of the reach of the imperial reach of the U.S. military have grown increasingly more vocal over the past decade. Now, some of these critics harken back to a traditional conservative isolationism. And while this voice is fairly muted within today's Republican Party, it's become increasingly prominent within libertarian circles, with persons such as former Representative Ron Paul giving consistent voice to this perspective. Within the Democratic Party, critiques of American imperial reach have also been fairly muted, with successful presidential candidates such as Bill Clinton or Barack Obama determined not to be outflanked on the right to their right on military matters, and accordingly embracing the interventionist assumptions that have driven this expansion of the United States military. Perhaps the recent rebuffing by congressional Republicans as well as Democrats of President Obama's own party of his desire to undertake military strikes against Syria in the wake of what was purported to be the Syrian government use of chemical weapons against its own people, maybe this signals the start of a rethinking of these interventionist assumptions that have guided both parties for at least 3 decades. Although it remains to be seen whether Republican opposition to those planned strikes against Syria was rooted in a philosophical understanding of the legitimate role of the United States military, or if it stemmed instead from a knee-jerk reaction to oppose anything that President Obama undertakes. But even if it's the latter, the fact that the US public overwhelmingly opposed direct US military intervention in the Syrian conflict might suggest that perhaps the United States public has grown weary of the burdens of empire. Perhaps. But while critics of interventionism and the growth of the American empire have had little effect within the 2 main US political parties, among political scientists, so-called political realism has been making a comeback, with many academics increasingly underscoring the prudential need or the pragmatic need to recognize the limits of US power and the corrosive impact of American empire on American domestic politics. And here I'll be looking at the historian and political theorist Andrew Bacevich, who offers a particularly intriguing example of this trend for our purposes, because as a committed Roman Catholic, Andrew Bacevich links recognizing the limits of US military power to the constraints of the Christian just war tradition. Andrew Bacevich today teaches at Boston University, but he got there after a distinguished career in the Army. A graduate of West Point, Bacevich first served in the Vietnam War, and then over the next 2 decades rose to the level of colonel before retiring from the Army in the early 1990s. After completing a dissertation on American military history at Princeton, Bacevich taught at West Point and then Johns Hopkins before ending up at Boston University. Bacevich's only son followed his father's path into the military and was killed in action while deployed in Iraq. So Bacevich, it should be clear, is not a pacifist and remains a firm believer in the justifiability from a Christian perspective of defensive wars. Yet over the past 10 years or so, Bacevich has developed a sustained critique of what he views as the distorted relationship of the United States to its military and to war. The titles of his books give an initial sense of what his concerns are. Titles like The New American Militarism, How Americans Are Seduced by War, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, and Breach of Trust, How Americans Failed Their Soldiers and Their Country. A committed Roman Catholic, as I mentioned, Bacevich also writes frequently for the Catholic magazine Commonweal and places his critique of American militarism within the context of Christian just war thinking on the use of military force. Bacevich advances several interrelated critiques of what he describes as the growth of a militarized American empire over the past several decades. First, he argues that the unrelenting expansion of the United States' military presence around the globe pushes against the just war criterion of the use of military force being a last resort. So again, we'll remember back to those just war criteria. One of them is the war a last resort, or have diplomacy and other forms of nonviolent action been used first? The world-spanning reach of the United States' military tempts the United States into turning to military power as a first or a second option rather than as a last resort, as it should be within traditional just war terms. Second, this temptation is exacerbated by ever-developing technologies of war, such as predator drones. Now, defenders of the use of drones in war argue that they help make war more just, namely by helping to minimize the risk of civilian casualties. Critics of drones counter that drone strikes have not been as surgical as their defenders claim, pointing to a high number of civilian casualties and to the fact that the military under the Obama administration defines all males over the age of 14 in the area of a drone strike to be a combatant, in other words, not a civilian. But even if we assume that drone strikes are so precise that they only kill persons being targeted, and that's a highly dubious assumption, it seems indisputable that the very existence of drone technology and other forms of other new types of technology intensify the temptation to turn to the use of military force as a first rather than as a last resort. And in this regard, we can see a very deep continuity between the Bush and Obama administrations, with the military under the Obama administration continuing a doctrine of preemptive attacks, attacks that are part of a declared global war on terror, which supposedly justifies preemptive military measures undertaken by the United States. Third, Basovich argues that the shift from the universal draft to an all-volunteer armed services has had the perverse effect of loosening the constraints on the use of military force. With a smaller and smaller percentage of the United States population directly connected to the armed services, the possibility of popular pressure on the government not to deploy troops into battle lessens. Politicians on both sides of the aisle fear being portrayed as weak by opposing particular military actions. And meanwhile, politicians and the general public make frequent use of what Basovich considers to be an obnoxious phrase, namely the phrase of supporting the troops. The very phrase supporting the troops, Basovich argues, underscores this transformation of the American military from one of citizen soldiers, in which most families had skin in the game, so to speak, in the form of a relative having served in the military or actively serving in the military, to a professionalized all-volunteer army, which happens to draw many of its soldiers from the country's economic underclass, an army which is distant from the experience of most average Americans. This shift, Basovich argues in his most recent book, Breach of Trust, has diminished political engagement by citizens around questions of war and peace, because most people are not faced directly by the question of whether or not a particular war or particular military actions are justified in the form of a loved one being deployed to battle. Instead, we offer what Basovich views as too often hollow expressions of support. One consequence of this shift from universal conscription to the all-volunteer military, Basovich observes, has been the fact that the number of veterans in the United States Congress is today at an all-time low, meaning that persons who have first-hand knowledge of war's darker sides have less influence than ever in making decisions shaping, have less influence than ever in shaping decisions about military intervention. It's not surprising, Basovich suggests, that the country has slid into an era of perpetual war when fewer veterans than ever help to shape military policy. Fourth, Basovich argues that the idea of the United States as an exceptional nation fosters a political culture that doesn't place a premium on limiting wars. The striking pretension that the United States is an exceptional nation helps to drive notions of the country as a guarantor for global security and as an enforcer of justice. Now, the idea of American exceptionalism, to be sure, can be traced all the way back to the Puritans. It's not a new idea. And with the Puritan notion of American colonies as a city on a hill, like the city on a hill of which Jesus spoke. In thinking of ourselves as a chosen or an exceptional people, Americans have been also, it must be granted, no different from many other countries around the world, other nations that have thought of themselves as being particularly special, as playing special world historical roles. Such idolatry is sadly nothing new, and it's not particularly American. But what's distinctive, if not completely new, is the marriage of such exceptionalist thinking to a global military reach. Predecessors might be the British Empire or the Roman Empire in their heydays. When a country has this type of global reach and also has a self-understanding of being an exceptional nation, at least two dangers arise. One is the temptation to confuse material self-interest of the nation, like securing control over natural resources, with noble goals that purportedly drive military intervention. And the second danger is to blind such nations to the limits of military power, because they assume that since they have this global reach and they have an exceptional calling, that they'll be able to achieve the military objectives that they set for themselves. And that brings us to the fifth and final critique from Basovich of the American empire that's arisen over the past decades. Namely, that the United States has lost any sense of the limits of its power, and so is continually surprised by all types of unintended consequences when it uses military force. Now, to be clear, when Basovich talks about limits of American power, he's not referring to the technological superiority that the United States military enjoys or to the quality of American troops. The United States, he recognizes, has the military capability, say, to invade Iraq and to depose its leadership, or to provide overwhelming air cover to allow Libyan rebels to overthrow the country's dictator. It's not limited in that fashion. But such military strength simply cannot guarantee desired political objectives. In fact, quite the opposite. The invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were undertaken in part out of a neoconservative vision to bring democracy to the Middle East and to help install pro-US regimes in those countries. Yet today Afghanistan is more divided and unstable than ever, and the invasion of Iraq led to massive ethnic cleansing as waves of Christians, Sunni Muslims, and Shia Muslims fled their homes in the face of increased tribalism and religious chauvinism. Meanwhile, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, American influence has dramatically ebbed, and the influence of Iran has grown. In Libya, meanwhile, the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime has led to a country on the brink of essentially splitting up into several different autonomous regions. Again, the recent rejection by the American public of armed U.S. intervention in the Syria conflict might signal that maybe more persons are beginning to question the limits of American military power, but that's arguably too soon to tell. Critics of American empire, like Andrew Basovich, I believe, expose common ground that Christian pacifists and just war Christians in the United States can share. Pacifist critiques of all wars as illegitimate, on the one hand, and a rigorous understanding of just war criteria, on the other hand, converge in a rejection of the machinery of perpetual war and of American empire that have stealthily developed over the past several decades. Now, to be sure, real theological issues divide and will continue to divide pacifist and just war Christians. But as just war Christians increasingly heed the warnings of military historians and political theorists like Andrew Basovich, they will be increasingly mindful of the limits of American military power and will be increasingly critical of doctrines of perpetual war that ignore such limits. And as that happens, just war and pacifist positions will increasingly converge. So that's the end of my talk. you have, or if there's a dialogue that takes place, or a multi-point conversation, that's wonderful. Yes?
You talked about war and neighbor love, and I thought I heard you say that a pacifist does not believe in taking life, any life. Could we just step back from the war issue and move it to the interpersonal?
Sure.
How would a pacifist respond to someone who threatens their life or the life of their family in terms of neighbor love or not taking life?
And of course, there would be the ideal response, and then there would be the realities of that in practice. And so one caveat or one thing to note up front is like someone like St. Augustine would have viewed defense of one's own life as illegitimate, but defending the life of, say, a loved one or a neighbor, that was legitimate, and so there's that. I mean, the answer to that would, there would be a continuum of different pacifist responses, but certainly non-resistant Christians, as well as most pacifist Mennonites, such as myself that I know, would say, well, we would look for alternatives to maybe interpose our bodies in between an attacker or someone else. Most pacifist Christians, most non-resistant Christians don't have personal handguns, and so that would be off the table. But the argument would be that in those types of cases, one has to be prepared for martyrdom, including the death of one's loved ones. And again, this points. One could argue that at the interpersonal realm, it's a version in a microcosm of the broader issue of war, because the question is, well, is it ever justified to take human life? Now, a real issue or a challenge for Christian pacifists would come at the level of, is it ever legitimate to, say, call the police in events where one is being threatened? Because the police in the United States come armed and are prepared to use lethal force. And this, again, points to the traditional just war critique of pacifist Christians, saying that, well, if you're willing to call on the police to defend you, then you are basically willing to have someone else do your dirty work, rather than take upon oneself the challenge or the dirty hands that might ensue from using violence to defend a loved one.
So there would be a difference between lethal force and non-lethal force or violence to end the situation.
That would be the distinction that pacifist Christians try to make in response to the critique that Reinhold Weaver makes of Christian pacifism, because Reinhold Weaver wants to argue that non-resistant love, as, say, traditionally espoused by the Amish or Old Order Mennonites, is like an idealized version of agape, or neighbor love, this pure neighbor love. But that, he would argue, just doesn't fly in the messy realm of outside of the close-knit life of small communities. And then he also argues, and basically accepts the assumptions made by non-resistant Christians, that coercive force that is short of lethal is a violation of the command to resist not evil. Pacifist Christians, in contrast, have argued that it's in fact fine to resist evil through nonviolent means and to use coercive tactics such as boycotts or protest marches, or even, say, interposing one's body between an attacker who is seeking to harm a loved one. And so that would be the way that pacifist Christians attempt to respond to that critique. Whether it's an adequate response, of course, you can all judge. Yes, back there.
A question for clarification. You had stated the number of U.S. military bases, and I missed that.
Yeah, estimates vary, but at least 700.
A follow-up to that, are most of these smaller than what bases once were? Because I know like the bases over in Germany, a lot of them have shrunk.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I mean, so some of them are smaller, some of them are larger. I mean, it all varies. What is definitely changed is that there are more of them and more agreements with different countries for, say, U.S. Airships, airplanes, and other equipment to, say, use the bases of other countries too. So it's the reach more than the number of personnel necessarily. It's just the extent of the global reach that is distinctive. Yes?
When you give that number of bases, I have to say that's absolutely astounding to me, especially given the number of bases here that I know of that have closed.
Mm.
Are those closures taken into consideration when those counts are done?
That's a good question. And I have to say that I'm not knowledgeable enough to know that. I mean, the figure, the different places I've seen the figure seem to imply that they are including bases in the United States. It's not simply referring to bases outside the United States. So I'm assuming it does, but I'm not an expert in that matter. Yes?
In how many areas in the world is your Mennonite Central Committee active?
Oh, thank you very much. That's a good, you can make a pitch for Mennonite Central Committee. And of course, we're accepting donations. But, Mennonite Central Committee works in over 50 countries around the world, and including in this response in the Philippines. We have active personnel in about 53 different countries, and we have some partnerships in about 12 more. So around 65 total for total number of involvements, but around 50, a little over 50, where we have workers
How do you
stationed.
get invited to come there with all this conflict?
That's a good question. Well, one connection that MCC has in many different countries is the presence of Mennonite churches in those countries, and so there are Mennonite churches in the Philippines, so that would be one point of entry. Also, many of our ecumenical partners, like Church World Service, also have church partners in those countries, and so that would be another way through ecumenical partnerships. I'll just state, this might be of interest to some of you, since we're in Lancaster County. The Mennonite Central Committee, it's a bit of a strange name, isn't it? I've always thought that it sounded, Mennonite Central Committee, but maybe it's not if you grew up here in Lancaster County, but I've always thought it to be a bit of a strange name. But it's called a Central Committee because it brings together Mennonites of all different types. Mennonites who are more modern, such as myself, as well as groups ranging from the Old Order Amish to the Old Order Mennonites to everything in between, basically. And so, even within the Mennonite Central Committee, we have both people who would have more of a non-resistant understanding of issues of war and peace, and those who would have a more activist, non-violent, pacifist understanding of war and peace. So that was a bit of a divergence from your question.
Are you in Afghanistan?
Yes, we are. MCC works with a Christian organization in Afghanistan that's been there for several decades that works to provide health services to low-income, impoverished communities across the country. A couple of years ago, you might have heard one of our workers from this county, Glenn Lapp, along with several other workers from IAM, or I can't think of what IAM stands for. It might be International Afghan Mission or something like this. But were murdered in Afghanistan, which was, of course, very tragic. But we have, I believe, 4 workers right now working with that with that ecumenical Christian organization in responding, and we also support the work of some leading Afghani organizations that promote women's education in the country. Yes?
Where do all your funds come from?
Okay, that's a good question. The vast majority of MCC's funding comes from individuals and congregations, and also from, we're very blessed by having a network of thrift stores across both the United States and Canada. So, and there are plenty of those here in Lancaster County that support both MCC's work as well as local ministries. So feel free to shop at those thrift stores. And then also there are relief sales in several communities across Canada and the United States. There's an annual relief sale that's held at the Farm Show Complex in Harrisburg in early April. Auctions and lots of food. I try not to go there because I'm trying to watch all the food. And there's also the oldest of those relief sales is organized by Old Order Amish and Mennonite communities in Quarryville, the Gap relief sale in early August of every year. The MCC also receives some limited funding from the Canadian government and also works in ecumenical partnerships with various Protestant and Catholic groups in Canada with what's called the Canadian Food Grains Bank, and in the United States is called Foods Resource Bank, where farmers donate crops or sell crops and then basically give crop equity that's used then to promote food security projects around the world. So that's, that would account the Canadian Food Grains Bank and Foods Resource Bank. Those two ecumenical organizations would account for maybe 20% of our funding, but then the vast majority of it coming, well over 70% coming from individuals, relief sales, thrift stores, congregations.
Do you have any big businesses giving you money?
That's a good question. I'm not in our donor relations department. I would have to think, like, what do you mean by big businesses? Like huge corporations,
Yes.
like Monsanto?
Yes.
No, not to my knowledge. I wouldn't say that that's never happened, but not to my knowledge. But again, I'm not from this part of the country. I'm out from Nebraska. But I have gathered that there are some Mennonites who have done well for themselves and have, you know, what might be viewed as a big business, but it's not at the level of like huge corporation. Yes?
During World War II, and I'm not clear as how this was done, but I think there were people who were passive, who entered the service, didn't carry a gun. This was the condition they went in, but they worked in the medical group. Is this true, or what was done there to make this possible?
No, that's a really good question. I think it was a non-combatant status. I think it was 1W. Someone probably knows this better than me. Is that right? 1W service. And there were some Mennonites who did do 1W service, especially in this part of the country, but even in some other parts of the United States in the 1940s. That would have been viewed as problematic by most Mennonites, and some of the people who would have entered 1W service would have come home to be excommunicated or shunned by their congregations. And then there were also some who entered into active military service. And alongside there were a lot of Church of the Brethren, and again there were a lot of Church of the Brethren folks in Lancaster County who entered into non-combatant 1W service, who were soldiers but who did not carry weapons and were serving in non-combat types of roles. And then alongside that, there was what was called civilian public service, which was a form of alternative service for non-resistant Amish Mennonites, but there were also Quakers, but also some Catholics, some other Protestants whose convictions had moved them to pacifist convictions. And those civilian public service camps did things like forest firefighting, replacements in mental hospitals across the United States, other forms of public service that wasn't related to the war effort. Yes, thank you for the question. Did you have a follow-up?
I didn't know, where did they fit into the two groups you decided? Or didn't they fit into?
No, that's a good question. Well, I mean, so the ones who would have been non-combatants would have been, following their conscience the best they understood it. And the Church of the Brethren, again, which I mentioned, places a strong value on individual Christians following their conscience. So even while it's been a traditional historic peace church, they've also placed a value on the individual following his or her conscience. And so those persons would have believed, well, maybe it's wrong to ever take human life, but would have also felt, well, we shouldn't be distant from or not participate in the significant effort that the United States is undertaking during World War II. And so that's how they would have discerned. But others, both pacifist and non-resistant Christians, felt that even entering into the military to be non-combatants was too supportive of the military effort and therefore compromised what they viewed as essential Christian convictions. Yes, way back and then short.
In your comments about United States exceptionalism, what do you see as a possibility that could change? Are there any glimmers of hope on the horizon that this coverage of the whole globe could retract at all, given the fact that the businesses do their business all around the world and expect the United States to protect them?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think if anything is going to help push against it, it's simply that the wars of the last, decade or slightly more than a decade has been such a drain on American finances that I think that could help spur more questioning at the grassroots level of whether that type of global military engagement is prudent. And I came across in the talk as somewhat skeptical about the widespread rejection of the Obama administration's initial desire to engage in military strikes against Syria. But looking at it more optimistically, one could look at it more optimistically and say that it was really striking how you had people from across the political spectrum uniting to say, no, we've been down this path and we don't like where it leads. So I don't want to be hyper optimistic, but we need to live in hope as well.
What do you think the RV would have been if there would have been Americans in Syria that were killed?
Yeah, no, that's a good.
Then I think we would have.
Yeah, no, that's true.
That was a faceless, as far as American. You brought up the businesses in the world. I think the guy who was in China, the businessman who was held captive, and then right away, we got to go in there and get this guy out. That you put a face on it like that now, and you talk about businesses. If we had a business in Syria that held captive, then we say, okay, we got to go in there and take them out.
No, that's a good point. There was a question right here.
Oh, I was just going to say the Quakers have always been known as pacifists.
Yes.
As an organization, do they work with you?
Yeah, so American Friends Service Committee, works in, I think, around 10 or 15 countries in the world, and MCC has, in many different places, worked in partnership. Our work in the Middle East, especially in Palestine and Israel, MCC and American Friends Service Committee have had a long history of partnership.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You were using war. You're using a term like perpetual war, and you're talking about evil and all this kind of stuff. How does it play out? When I think of a term like perpetual war, I don't think of it as like we framed war as a military guns and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
I'm talking about the lower level of war on each other. How does that play out in your community? Because I know some of the communities are a little more close-knit. We're starting to roll into our court systems because of abuses and other things like that. How's that playing out? That is war.
Yeah, no, of course, and
the violence
anyone who romanticizes Mennonite or Amish community, there are many wonderful things about Mennonite and Amish communities, but they participate in, and I think that they would be the first to recognize this as well. They participate in the fallenness of creation and of humanity as much as anyone. So these are not perfect communities. And something like the close-knit nature of an Amish community, the one has many strengths, but it also has many weaknesses as well. It can cover up, the
But not
horrors
so
of
much
all
the
types,
cover-
the horrors of all types of human sinfulness.
Not so much the cover up, but how they deal with that then? I mean,
Yeah.
do they frame it the way we look at it, or is it viewed as something different?
Well, so that's a good question. I mean, traditionally, and we would need someone like Don Crable at Elizabethtown to
Right.
do this better, answer this better. I mean, traditionally, older Amish, older Mennonites, even, say, my wife's grandfather, would have never gone to court for any reason. And especially not against a fellow church member, but also not against another church member. Because again, it was viewed as compromising the value of non-resistance. And so whether it's a land dispute, whether it was questions of inheritance, whether it was other types of, you name the type of problem that could happen in a community, you don't go to the police, you don't go to the court system because that is compromising non-resistance. Now, certainly, Mennonites like myself, many of them do go to court and don't seem to think it, theologically problematic.
But I was thinking some of the violence on the children, the abuses of children.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about sexual abuses. I mean,
Right.
that's across the board. That's in any community.
Sure.
I'm not pointing this out at all for any reason other than I think there is violence, but how do you frame it or how do you view it then? What I see as violence to say a spouse, they see as, well, this is their duty, or something like that. And so.
And I can't speak on the marital relationships because again, I'm not familiar enough with old order types of cultures
Right.
to know that, but I certainly know enough that, corporal punishment of children is not viewed as violating non-resistance and is viewed as perfectly normal.
Right.
There was a case recently in Winnipeg, these aren't Amish, but it was and not old order Mennonites, but it's a very conservative Mennonite group, which is fairly withdrawn from the rest of Canadian society, and several of their children were taken away by the equivalent of Canadian social services
Right.
recently because of corporal punishment issues, and it's been very traumatizing for the community. One would also imagine it's been traumatizing for the children as well. But so, this is to say that, again, old order groups aren't distinctive in that. You have a lot of, on the more, further reaches of the fundamentalist world, you would have an embrace of, corporal punishment of children as being normal, but you wouldn't have a non-resistant theology to go with it either, which does, make it seem a little strange. Good question.
I want to thank Mr. Alain Epp Weaver to be with us. Before we end with prayer, just a reminder that Pastor Russ Rockwell will be back the next 2 weeks to finish up his series on liturgy, and so we encourage you to come back and finish up our series on that over the next couple of weeks. So again, thank you, Alan. We appreciate you being with us.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
And, a lot to think about. You want to lead us in prayer?
Heavenly Father, give you thanks for the rich opportunity to think with one another and to discern with one another what it means to love our neighbors as ourselves, what it means to love our enemies. Help us to show that love in our daily lives to all whom we encounter. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.